Today, I was thinking about doing something that was a little bit more in the realm of culture. And we've done a few of these episodes in the past. We've been talking about novels that are notable, literature that I've read or that I've appreciated. Talked about For Whom the Bell Tolls from Ernest Hemingway. And we've talked about um, the Gulag Archipelago from Solzhenitsyn. And today I thought we'd talk about just like a aspect of what I see of Canadian culture, growing up in Canada and having I would say in today's day and age, a relatively non-typical early upbringing in Canada because we lived on a ranch that was 15 miles out of town on a dirt road. It took us about a half hour each morning to drive to town on, like I said, dirt gravel road. Our driveway was over a mile long and it was pretty rough. Definitely needed a 4x4 at many times in the year and like be mudding out of there. So we didn't have running water or power when we moved into that place in 1974. And I managed to dig up a clip of Super Super 8 footage that I'm guessing my mom must have shot when we were first living up in and moving into our ranch. And here I'll show you the clip here. This is the corrals out front of our place. You can see the sense of humor that I received from people I grew up around. There's the house in the background and the corral, a good shot of the corral. And you can see in the back there's like a wooded area that was, behind there was a big lake. This was a little bit of a low area. There was like a high area that surrounded the whole house where the house was built up onto the farm. And there's the corral, my dad on his horse. One of our cows. There's another shot of one of the sheds beside our house there in the background. And that was sort of outside of like a fence that fenced in the entire like inner part of the property. And then the property from there extended. I'll go back to the property from there. If the camera had been turned, it was quite a vast open area going towards the hayfields, and then a wooded area that was up on a rise, and that was the way out, the driveway out, and you would drive a mile out, and all of that was our property. I mean, it was kind of a narrow, long strip, so it was quite a long, and then we had a lease property that was the equivalent size. So I think it was a total of 320 acres out in the middle of the wilderness. Like it had been a homestead in the early part of the century, and it was old style construction, as you could see in the video, in the old film there. In fact, let's go back to it again just to kind of see if we can point out a few more things. And just the construction, that cracks me up, those sheep. Yeah, you can see even then it was quite an old building. And that other building out beside it, we had a couple of cabins that see out those other outbuildings. And I don't know if they get a look at the barn here, but it was further. If you kept panning on that last shot, the barn was down in a kind of a hollow. Big giant barn. So, yeah, it was different. Like for me, of course, growing up like that, I didn't know anything else. I'd watch TV shows and movies like The Lone Ranger and stuff, and I thought that was like regular life. I mean, obviously, I knew that we had cars and motorcycles and stuff like that. It had been more advanced, but literally, we grew hay and had cattle and sheep, and we didn't. That was early on when we had sheep. Later, we didn't have any as many sheep. We moved on to cattle, and we always had chickens and horses and pigs. Um, so there was, and then my dad loved geese, which they were evil, but he loved them. And so yeah, it was quite a rustic upbringing. What I was thinking about is um, the level of sort of day to day survival that you would have to do. Depending on the time of year, you would be facing different things. Like in the summer, um, the house was hot, but it was, other than that, it was fine. It wasn't too bad. But in the winters, the house was fairly leaky, and um, it had like chinked logs rather than nowadays they scribe, like a modern log home is a scribed log. So you have the bottom profile of the log that's like a circular log, and then the other log goes on top, and it's like cupped so that it's scribed so that it fits together like a puzzle. In the old days, they'd put log to log, and then it would be kind of rough, and there'd be gaps in there, and they would stuff chinking in there, and that's the kind of building that we had. And I can remember as a kid pulling that caulking. It was like kind of like mortar with like material, like some kind of like insulation, but it at first it was just mostly dried mortar that was in there, and then my dad went through with like pink insulation and jammed it in there. But I got in trouble for pulling it out. I shouldn't have been doing it. But you could literally look right out the through a crack in the wall and see what the weather was like outside from bed. And yeah, so it was certainly a different level of living. And then now having my journey gone from that to living overseas. I've lived overseas, and then like in a technology industry. So even within my own lifetime, which is half a century, uh, certain parts of Canada have changed a lot. Now, do people live like this anymore? Well, some do. There is a community of people that seek to be off grid or whatever. We were different because even though like my parents chose that lifestyle, they moved there from the coast. Um, my dad had spent a bunch of time on a dairy farm, his aunt's dairy farm, when he was young. He lived there and helped her for several years. So he was kind of a farm, and then they had a farm as well, my grandparents. So there was a lot of farming sort of, in his background as well. But yeah, so people do go off grid now, and they live more like this. But I think one thing that was a little bit different for us is it wasn't specifically the lack of like grid that we were interested in. It was the property. The property was great. It was a beautiful property. It was an old, like I said, not an extremely historic property, but it had been around for several generations. It wasn't a newer build. Like I said, I don't know for sure how the building was, but I'm guessing it was made in the early part of the 1900s, like maybe 1920 or something like that, or maybe a little later, 1930. But for things to look as old as it did, it was like rough hewn plank walls inside that had also gaps in them so you could see through the walls. Interior walls, they weren't like framed in. It was a very different type of construction. My dad modernized it though. Like he didn't go out there. I guess homes, off gridders, they kind of do that too. They try to get the amenities. Um, so we did that too. Like he plumbed it, he had put electricity into it. Then we had a generator. Then we had a pump so that we could get running water. And then eventually the neighborhood got together and built a power line into the property, and everybody got power, but it was people donating their own time, labor, and machinery. So the neighbors had a lot of the neighbors, including us, we had a cat, like a bulldozer, and we had a couple of tractors, all kinds of haying equipment. But my close neighbors that we were close with for my whole life, the Bells, they were about 5 miles away. They were our nearest neighbor. Cross country, it wasn't quite as far, and the power line went past their place and then through to us. So if you walk the power line, I think it was only about 3 miles, but it was rough, and in the winter you could never get through there without a snowmobile or something. But yeah, they made an agreement with BC Hydro to clear the land. And then BC Hydro, I think, provided the poles, and our guys, our community members, all the men and women too, and the equipment in the neighborhood, all the different families. There was maybe like, I don't know, maybe, my guess is like maybe 7 or 8 families in the area, maybe less, 6, 7. And it was a big area, but everybody was spread apart like by miles. Very different type of, even now, if you go out into the area where I lived as a kid, it's wild. It's rustic. There's nothing out there. It's still a dirt road, 15 miles long. Yeah, same thing. I know the people roughly that I know the people that live out there now. In fact, the people that live out there now, the lady that lives out there, she was my mom's nurse when my mom passed away. For the whole process of her being in the hospital. And they had kind of a unique bond because they had both lived on this property. And really, even though the place was quite old, like probably over about 100 years old now, it had only had like maybe 5 or 6 families that lived on there. I don't even know if it's that many. Yeah, I think around that probably. I think there was at least 3 people that lived there before, 2 or 3 that lived there before us. And then there was, I think, 2 after us. So let's say there was 3, and then us, that's 4, and then so 6. Yeah, 6 families in 100 years. It's a property I wish I had. I wish I owned that property, but the people that own it are really nice, good people. And it's changed. They've upgraded the buildings and stuff like that. It's not the same as when we lived there. Anyways, that's it for this one. A little culture, a little background on the way Canada, or at least parts of Canada, were back in the day. That's back in the early 70s. That's when I was like maybe 2 or 3. So it was, 74, 75. 50 years ago in the Cariboo, out on a pretty rustic farm. We'll catch you on the next one. Take care. Bye for now.